Last month, while filming a private tour of the Melsonby Hoard at the Yorkshire Museum, one object immediately caught my attention. Decorated with human faces, Mediterranean coral and elaborate metalwork, the vessel was discovered amongst the largest collection of Iron Age metalwork ever found in Britain. Yet according to the Yorkshire Museum's curators, its closest parallels may not lie in Britain at all. Instead, the bowl resembles a Lebes, a type of wine-mixing vessel associated with the Etruscans of ancient Italy. More surprising still, archaeologists believe it was probably made locally here in Britain. If that interpretation is correct, then somebody in Iron Age Yorkshire was familiar with a Mediterranean vessel type found more than 1,000 miles away. So how did a form associated with Etruscan Italy find its way into northern Britain? For much of the last century, Britain before Rome was often portrayed as a distant world on the edge of Europe, separated from the great centres of Mediterranean civilization. Yet a growing body of archaeological and scientific evidence is revealing a very different picture, which may help explain how a vessel resembling an Etruscan Lebes came to be produced in Iron Age Yorkshire. This is the story of the Yorkshire Lebes. The vessel was discovered as part of the Melsonby Hoard, a remarkable collection of Iron Age metalwork recovered from a field near the village of Melsonby in North Yorkshire. Found only a short distance from Stannic Iron Age fortifications, the vast stronghold associated with the Brigantes and Queen Cartimandua, the hoard is now being described as the largest collection of Iron Age metalwork ever discovered in Britain. More than 800 objects have so far been identified: chariots and wagons torn apart and burnt, elaborate horse harnesses, weapons, cauldrons, mirrors, Mediterranean coral, and luxury items linked to a world stretching far beyond northern Britain. Archaeologists now believe many of these objects were deliberately destroyed during a major ceremonial event, possibly connected to the funeral of a high-status individual at the very moment Rome was extending its influence into Britain. The scale of the deposit has transformed our understanding of northern Britain during the late Iron Age. Rather than an isolated region beyond the centres of power in southern Britain, the Melsonby Hoard points to a community of immense wealth, capable of acquiring prestige goods, commissioning elaborate metalwork, and maintaining connections that may have extended across Britain and into continental Europe. These connections can be seen throughout the hoard. Mediterranean coral appears on a number of objects, while some of the vehicle fittings have their closest parallels in Iron Age finds from Denmark. At either end of the deposit, archaeologists uncovered two large vessels that appear to have been deliberately placed upside down before burial. One was a large cauldron, and the other was a wine-mixing vessel decorated with human faces, coral, and ornate metalwork. According to the Yorkshire Museum, its design is comparable to a type of vessel known as a Lebes, a form more commonly associated with the Etruscans of ancient Italy. During my visit to the exhibition, the curator explained why the vessel has attracted so much attention.
Well, yeah, I'd love to see, just hear you talk briefly about some of the items
Sure.
you've got here, just so the viewers,
Yes.
just to whet their appetite a little bit.
I'll do a lightning fast tour of some of the star objects that we have in each section. So in our feast section we have this wine mixing bowl. Doesn't look like much at the moment because it's still wrapped in this conservation bandaging plaster, and that's because it's so incredibly fragile. It's actually in many pieces, so we've chosen the three most substantial pieces, but there's lots more in a box downstairs.
So more to be
with. Pieced together, yes. But what you can see is that disc on top would have been a lid, probably.
Okay, yeah.
And we have this decorative face that would have adorned the edges of it. This is a local style of decoration, but actually the vessel itself is most similar to a Lebes, which is a type of wine mixing bowl for mixing flavours into wine that is only found really in Etruscan parts of Italy. So it's a very, very tantalising hint of those Mediterranean connections that the people living in Iron Age North Yorkshire had with the wider world.
The vessel's resemblance to an Etruscan Lebes is intriguing enough on its own. These wine-mixing bowls are most commonly associated with Etruria in central Italy, where they formed part of a wider culture of elite feasting, display and social status. At Melsonby, however, the picture appears to be rather more complicated. While the overall form of the vessel resembles examples from the Mediterranean world, the decorative human faces attached to it appear to belong to a local Iron Age tradition. Rather than a straightforward import from Italy, archaeologists believe the vessel may represent a local interpretation of a Mediterranean design. If that interpretation is correct, the significance of the bowl extends beyond the movement of a single object. An imported vessel would simply demonstrate that goods were travelling between different regions of Europe. A locally made vessel, inspired by a Mediterranean form, suggests something far more difficult to trace: the movement of ideas, influences, and artistic traditions across vast distances.
That's really fascinating, actually, because I think I was just reading about how before the Greeks expanded into areas like Massalia, modern-day Marseille, that the Etruscans were primarily trading in that kind of region until the Greeks kind of took over that trade. So it's interesting to see what could have transpired during this period of time then.
Absolutely, it raises all sorts of questions about how did this influence and this style reach Britain, reach the north of Iron Age Britain, particularly with this local decorative element mixed in as well. This seems to not be a vessel that was brought, so where did they see these vessels? How did they find out about them to then recreate them locally? Fascinating.
So it was made in this country but based on that style?
Probably, and that's based on the fact that these human faces are quite a local decorative style.
The curator's comments highlight what may be the most significant aspect of the vessel. The mystery is not simply how an object from Italy reached Britain. Instead, the question becomes how craftspeople in ancient Yorkshire became familiar with a vessel type associated with a civilization more than 1,000 miles away. Before exploring how that influence may have travelled across Europe, it is worth taking a closer look at the people with whom these vessels are most closely associated: the Etruscans of ancient Italy. Long before Rome emerged as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, central Italy was home to a collection of wealthy city-states known collectively as Etruria. Between the 8th and 4th centuries BC, the Etruscans developed one of the most influential cultures of the ancient world. Their merchants traded across the seas, their metalworkers produced some of the finest bronze objects of antiquity, and their aristocrats displayed their status through elaborate feasting ceremonies. Wine played an important role within this elite culture, and among the vessels associated with these traditions were large mixing bowls known as lebetes, which were used to dilute wine and combine it with other ingredients before drinking. Like many prestige objects of the ancient world, they carried social meaning and were associated with wealth, hospitality, and participation in an elite culture that extended across much of the Mediterranean. The comparison with Etruscan lebetes does not necessarily mean that Etruscans ever reached North Yorkshire, nor does it prove that the vessel itself travelled directly from Italy. Yet, if the bowl was indeed made locally, it still requires an explanation. At some point before the hoard was buried, knowledge of this Mediterranean vessel form appears to have reached Britain and been incorporated into a local tradition. The question is how. For much of the last century, Britain before Rome was often imagined as a remote island lying beyond the principal centres of European civilization. Yet archaeology has revealed a very different picture. Long before the Roman conquest, communities in Britain were participating in exchange networks that stretched across Europe and into the Mediterranean world. One of the principal reasons was the presence of a resource that would become essential to Bronze Age societies across Europe: tin. Although often overlooked today, tin was one of the most strategically important resources of the Bronze Age. When combined with copper, it produced bronze, a metal that transformed warfare, agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade across much of Europe and the Near East. The problem was that tin is relatively rare. While copper could be obtained from many different regions, economically significant sources of tin were far less common. Among the richest deposits in Europe were those of Cornwall and Devon in southwest Britain. Archaeological evidence suggests that these resources were already being exploited during the Bronze Age, while recent scientific studies have provided remarkable new evidence for just how far British tin may have travelled. Using isotopic analysis, researchers have examined tin ingots recovered from Bronze Age shipwrecks and other archaeological sites across the Mediterranean. In several cases, the chemical signatures of these ingots closely match ore sources in Cornwall and Devon, suggesting that British tin was reaching Mediterranean markets more than 1,000 years before the Melsonby Hoard was ever buried. These discoveries have transformed our understanding of Britain's role in the ancient world. Rather than occupying the distant fringe of Europe, Britain appears to have formed part of a much wider system of exchange, linking communities across thousands of miles. These connections were not maintained by seaborne travel alone. Across Western Europe, major river systems provided natural corridors linking inland communities with coastal trading centres, while overland routes connected regions beyond the navigable waterways. Goods arriving on the Atlantic coast could move along networks that incorporated rivers such as the Rhône and Saône, as well as established land routes, creating connections between Northern Europe and Mediterranean markets. Through these systems, raw materials, prestige goods, technologies, and cultural influences were able to travel far greater distances than might otherwise have been possible. While these networks cannot tell us exactly how the influence behind the Melsonby vessel reached Yorkshire, nor do they prove direct contact between Iron Age Britain and Etruria, they do demonstrate that Britain had long been connected to wider European and Mediterranean worlds through networks capable of moving goods, materials, and perhaps ideas across extraordinary distances. Many of these Bronze Age systems would eventually fragment during the upheavals that marked the end of the Bronze Age. Yet long-distance exchange did not disappear. New routes emerged, new powers rose to prominence, and by the 4th century BC, a different network connected Britain to continental Europe and the Mediterranean. It is within that world that we encounter one of the most important witnesses to prehistoric Britain, the Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia. By the 4th century BC, these long-distance connections begin to emerge from the archaeological record and enter written history. Our most important witness is a Greek explorer, geographer, and navigator named Pytheas, a citizen of the Mediterranean trading city of Massalia, modern-day Marseille. Sometime around 320 BC, Pytheas undertook a remarkable voyage into the Atlantic. Although his original work, Peritou Oceanu, or On the Ocean, has not survived, later Greek and Roman authors preserved fragments of his account, allowing us to glimpse the world he encountered. Pytheas was the first known writer to leave a detailed description of Britain and its surrounding seas. He recorded information about its geography, its peoples, and the trade networks operating along the Atlantic coast. What makes his account particularly important is that it confirms something archaeology is increasingly revealing. Britain was not an isolated island at the edge of the known world. Instead, it formed part of a wider Atlantic system linking communities from Iberia to Gaul and beyond. Among these commodities moving through these networks was tin, the very resource that had helped connect Britain to continental Europe since the Bronze Age. Pytheas describes the tin trade of southwest Britain, providing one of the earliest written glimpses of exchange routes that had likely existed in various forms for centuries. Later classical accounts of this trade suggest that goods often passed through multiple hands before reaching their final destinations. Rather than a simple route linking Britain directly to the Mediterranean, commodities could move from one community to another through chains of merchants and intermediaries extending across Europe. Such networks provide a useful reminder that ideas and artistic influences did not require direct contact between distant societies in order to travel remarkable distances. By the time Pytheas reached Britain, the great Bronze Age systems had long since disappeared, yet the movement of goods, people, and ideas continued through new Iron Age networks that connected the Atlantic facade with the Mediterranean world. The world encountered by Pytheas did not emerge in isolation. Long before his voyage, Mediterranean goods were already moving north through Europe, reaching communities far beyond the shores of Italy and southern France. Archaeologist Michael Dietler notes that by the late 6th century BC, Greek and Etruscan objects were finding their way more than 500 kilometres north of Mediterranean France into the so-called Western Hallstatt zone, a region encompassing parts of Burgundy, southwest Germany and Switzerland. This evidence is important because it demonstrates that Mediterranean influence was already penetrating deep into temperate Europe centuries before the Roman conquest. The situation appears to have changed during the following centuries. As the Greek colony of Massalia expanded its commercial influence along the coast of southern Gaul, many of the earlier Etruscan trade connections were gradually replaced by Greek networks operating through the Rhone corridor and its associated river systems. Dietler notes that by the early 5th century BC, Massalia had largely replaced the earlier trade in Etruscan goods throughout much of the lower Rhone basin, becoming the dominant source of Mediterranean imports for centuries thereafter. What matters for the Yorkshire Lebes is not whether a particular trader or traveller carried knowledge of these vessels northwards. Rather, it is the broader picture that emerges from the archaeological evidence. By the Iron Age, Europe was already connected by overlapping networks of exchange through which objects, materials, technologies, and cultural influences could travel remarkable distances. Against that backdrop, the appearance of a vessel inspired by an Etruscan form in Iron Age Yorkshire begins to look slightly less mysterious. The Melsonby Lebes remains an archaeological puzzle. No inscription tells us who made it. No surviving account explains how knowledge of this Mediterranean form reached northern Britain. The precise route by which its influence travelled may never be known. Yet the vessel does not exist in isolation. It was discovered within a hoard that contains Mediterranean coral, continental European parallels, and evidence for connections extending far beyond Yorkshire. In addition to this, it also emerged from a society wealthy enough to commission elaborate metalwork, acquire prestige goods, and participate in networks that linked northern Britain to the wider European world. scientific analysis has also demonstrated that British tin was most likely reaching Mediterranean markets during the Bronze Age, while Pytheas provides a written glimpse of the Atlantic trade networks that continued into the Iron Age. Evidence from continental Europe further demonstrates that Etruscan and Greek influences were capable of travelling far beyond their places of origin through the interconnected societies of temperate Europe. Against this backdrop, the appearance of a vessel inspired by an Etruscan Lebes in Iron Age Yorkshire becomes entirely plausible, even if the precise chain of transmission remains beyond our reach. The Yorkshire Lebes does not prove that Etruscans sailed to Britain, nor does it demonstrate direct contact between Yorkshire and Italy. What it reveals instead is something perhaps more interesting: that the communities of Iron Age Britain were not isolated spectators on the edge of the known world, but were active participants in networks of exchange through which materials, ideas, artistic styles, and cultural influences could travel across remarkable distances. The Yorkshire Lebes may never reveal exactly how its Mediterranean inspiration reached northern Britain. Yet perhaps that is not the most important question. What matters is that it exists at all. A vessel inspired by a form associated with Etruscan Italy, produced in Iron Age Yorkshire, and buried amongst one of the most remarkable hoards ever discovered in Britain. More than 2,000 years later, it stands as a reminder that the peoples of pre-Roman Britain were connected to a wider world in ways that archaeology is still only beginning to understand. If discoveries like the Melsonby Hoard fascinate you, then much of my own research has focused on the wider trade networks that connected Britain to continental Europe and the Mediterranean long before the Roman conquest. My upcoming book explores the Bronze Age tin and amber routes that linked Britain to the wider ancient world, the same networks that later Greek authors like Pytheas of Massalia would encounter in their Iron Age form centuries later. Drawing directly from archaeological evidence, classical sources, and modern academic research, the book traces the movement of tin from Britain into the Mediterranean, as well as the amber routes stretching south from the Baltic and the maritime corridors that connected these distant regions together. In addition to this, the book also includes my own translations and analysis of the surviving Greek texts relating to Pytheas, presented alongside the original ancient Greek, with linguistic breakdowns and commentary exploring how the ancient world understood Britain and the northern seas. Every section is fully sourced and referenced with page citations throughout, allowing readers to follow the evidence directly for themselves. If that sounds interesting, there'll be a pre-order link pinned in the comments and more information down in the description below.